Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session on what we learned about science journalism in the year of COVID-19. The session is organized by Samsung Press Foundation and is part of World Journalists Conference, hosted by Journalists Association of Korea. I am Jin Yoon. I teach journalism at Korea University and Ewha Women's University, and I'm delighted to be here moderating this particular session. It's been more than a year since COVID-19 has swept the world. During this time, we have science journalists working around the clock, informing the public about the disease, its impact on our health, the vaccine development, and its long-term implications. Our session today hopes to shed light on how science journalism has changed over the years, its role in our society, and its future. We'll start with a presentation, followed by questions from me, and then we'll open the floor for more questions. If you have any questions, feel free to jot them down in the chat box on Zoom, and we'll turn to you. The earlier, the better. Without further ado, let me introduce our speaker, Deborah Blum. Deborah is the director of the Knight Science Journalism Program at MIT. She is also a Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist, a columnist, and author of 6 books. Her most recent book, The Poison Squad, was named a New York Times notable book and became the subject of a PBS documentary. It's a great privilege to have her speak to us, and please join me in welcoming Deborah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really a privilege to be here and to talk with you about some of the lessons for science journalists from the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the lessons from history as well. And if you'll just give me a moment, I'm going to share my screen. So what we learned about science journalism in the time of COVID-19. And it's a privilege to be here. As I said, the illustration behind this particular slide is actually from the bubonic plague in medieval times in Europe, and I just like it because it's another portrait of the many pandemics that have plagued us and that we have told stories about. And I want to talk not only about what we've learned from COVID, but a few ways that I think we are doing things smarter or more smartly than we used to. Image of COVID-19 with the spike proteins all over it. So pandemics will remind you of how important the job of a science journalist is in this sense. Who is going to tell the story of the research, explore what scientists are doing, question the ethics, visit and explore laboratories, understand the research, have the connections, if not for science journalists. We actually, in a public health situation like this, depend on science, medical, and public health journalists probably more than we usually do, but it should be a reminder of how important our job is, even when we're not in the middle of such a global challenge. And I think of this in part, I was talking to a friend of mine who at STAT, who is which is a biomedical publication based in Boston, and who has covered numerous pandemics and is at the point that recently she texted Anthony Fauci, who is head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease here. And he called her back 5 minutes later to talk about the issue she wanted to raise. We have journalists in place, and we're lucky to have them, who have been covering these situations for a long time, who understand them, who are trained in them, and this is a very important job. It's also important to remember that our job is not just local. We're not only covering COVID-19 or any pandemic in our own countries, but we're looking at it in a global sense. And these are two maps that were generated within the last week. The one, as you'll see in the orange and yellow, is more of a broad brush look at where the pandemic is most challenging at the moment. And the one with the large blue circles on the other side is actually generated by the WHO, World Health Organization. And it picks up particularly on hotspots. And it's both of those stories that matter in the pandemic. The consistent spread of the pandemic, COVID-19 has killed more than 3 million people worldwide at this point, and the places where the pandemic is posing new challenges. As I said, we've been here before, and this is a map of the 1918 global pandemic, influenza pandemic. And as you'll see, there are several spikes and peaks. There were actually 3 major waves of influenza in this period. As you'll see, I mean, it was a long time ago, but in its way, these are the same faces we see now, masked, crippled by the disease. And as you see, in this particular case, this pandemic began in the fall, flattened out over the summer and spring of 1918, rose again in the fall and winter into 2019, and then spiked one more time. And the spikes were directly related to 2 things that we see in this pandemic today: pandemic fatigue, people no longer wanting to wear masks, people no longer wanting to be socially distanced, and some mutations of the virus that made it more infectious. And the estimate is that this pandemic, by the time it was done, killed a minimum of 25 million people worldwide. So we hope that COVID-19 will not rise to those heights, so to speak. There are other lessons from history and mistakes we've made as science journalists. I wanted to flag this one from another influenza pandemic in the 1960s, particularly. This is a cover of Time magazine. This was an influenza that began in poultry. And as you see, there's this very overstated headline, death threat, with a picture of a chicken. Don't do this, right? One of the tricky things, and we've certainly seen this in this pandemic, is the fine line that science journalists have to walk, in which we both want to portray the risk and the threat and make sure that people understand when their safety is at risk, but we're not trying to scare them into paralysis, and we're not trying to overstate the case to the point that people no longer trust us. Because one of the other fine lines we walk as journalists and as science journalists is in being a trusted source of information. So one more point from a previous pandemic, Ebola, we debunk information. And this is something that comes up. We see it in COVID-19, but I also want to make the case that you see this every time there is a major viral spread like this. There are going to be stories that are told. There are going to be conspiracy theories that arise. You know, I think we're always shocked by them. I myself, when this pandemic first boiled up, thought, for instance, well, this will be an answer to the anti-vaccine movement, because clearly the way to control this virus is through vaccines, and I have been proven wrong repeatedly at that point. Some of the other myths that we need to counter is the idea that these viruses are somehow targeted at controlling people. They are government plots to make sure that we all obey. You know, and to do that, some of what we do is just to explain the science, explain the virus. And one of the things that I want to bring up in terms of COVID-19 is that we see these kinds of conspiracies arise, not only about the virus, but about the response. Here, this is the Moderna vaccine. It's an mRNA vaccine. This is just a remarkable technology. Not that mRNA technology wasn't well developed before COVID-19, but the fact that we were able to harness it so quickly and start generating virus vaccines or protection against the virus so quickly. Again, you see these kinds of conspiracy theories arise. Here is an anti-vaxxer in the United States. Here is a sign mRNA vaccines will change your DNA. And the sign says no joke. It's completely a joke. That's not going to happen. This is a tiny bit of the RNA of the virus, particularly attached to the spike protein, and simply stimulates the immune system to respond to that protein. But you get these kinds of myths arising, and again, it falls to all journalists, but often to science journalists, to try to counter these kinds of conspiracy theories. So how do we do it? We continue to explain what these are. We find ways to tell stories that break into these particular audiences when we can, and that's a especially challenging part of this. And we tell our stories over and over and over again. And I wanted in this case to mention one of my favorite quotes as someone who has long time covered science, which is from an 18th century professor of medicine. Do not fear to repeat what has been said. Men, this is the 18th century, so it's going to be men, need the truth dinned into their ears many times from all sides. The first rumor makes them prick up their ears, the second registers, the third enters. And many times when I'm reporting on a situation like this in which there's continual flow of bad information, this is what I remind myself. I remind myself that we do our best work by repeating the correct information. We get it right. We say it over and over again. This is really challenging in journalism because one of the things about journalism, which is an event-driven medium or profession, is that we have a tendency to go, didn't I already say that? Haven't I already told that story? And we need to find ways to overcome that problem and take the same information and find new and fresh ways to tell it. And I want to mention briefly that this is exactly the problem that science journalists have always had in reporting on climate change. It's what climate change reporters call a slow drip story. It doesn't have the instant drama of a crisis. Instead, it's repeated smaller crises. And journalism is not entirely well suited to that, but this is something where I think we can do better. And COVID-19 will tell you that. We need to be accurate. We need to explain the science well, and we need to do it over and over and over again until the information that comes from us is equivalent or even more than the information that comes from people who are making up stories about what's going on. As part of this, it's important to remember to approach official sources, even sometimes with caution, because a source is a person of power, does not mean that source is always someone who is giving you accurate information. Again, this is a standard rule of journalism, but we've seen this often in this particular pandemic. The photo I have here is from Brazil, where the president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, has repeatedly denied that the pandemic exists and repeatedly made up stories about vaccines. And so even though in the normal hierarchy, you might make an argument that the leader of a country would be considered a high-profile, trustworthy source, we have to weigh our sources in this case. Mm-hmm. Certainly true in the United States. In the previous administration, this quote is from March of 2020, not March of this year. But it was and it was from an interview that the journalist Bob Woodward did with Trump, in which he revealed to him that he had deliberately downplayed the dangers of the pandemic. And in this particular conversation, he said he didn't want it to create panic. In other conversations, he said it was because he didn't want the numbers to make him look bad. And so you're put in a really interesting situation of having the person with the largest megaphone in your country provide bad information. And so it's very important to remind yourself going forward in situations like this to be a trusted source by using trusted sources. One of the ways we do that is to recognize that this is a moving target. The virus is a moving target. The facts of science change. The facts change in a pandemic. I love this, illustration, which is based, of course, on the famous woodcut of the Great Wave. And this was an illustration that actually appeared in Science magazine a few months ago when they were doing a story on the deluge of papers and preprints that were coming out in the pandemic, many times contradicting each other, and how journalists and researchers try to deal with sifting through this sort of tidal wave of information. And that's also a really important point for us, both to consider the source, where is it published? What's the history of the researcher? We don't always, we want to be careful that the person who's doing the study actually has some experience, for instance, in virology or in antiviral drugs or in vaccines. And we also want to look at the weight of the evidence. And so a lot of times in good science reporting like this, what we want to do is do our best to sift through this tidal wave of information and try to figure out where the scientific consensus is and report from the point of the weight of evidence. Having said that, there's all of these situations, and you probably remember from early in the COVID pandemic, there were debates about whether the virus was airborne. There was debates about how far you had to be from each other. There were debates about how long an actually actively dangerous viral particle lived on a surface. So what we do, and we're doing this, is we make it clear to our readers that science is a process. It's a process of inquiry. It's a process of inquiry that gets smarter about what's going on with each study, and we are following that process of inquiry. And this is not that this is wrong, that what they said yesterday was wrong. It was what they knew at the time. And it's really on us. And again, that's a challenge to try to convey this uncertainty as something that actually leads us to certainty. We vet sources. This is Anthony Fauci. Find your trusted sources and be a trusted source. Data needs context. This is from early in the pandemic, where you see these skyrocketing numbers of different countries and reporting what's going on. Those numbers were not particularly accurate because South Korea looks great in this particular slide. But if you looked at the US or you looked at Italy, they were hugely undercounting what was going on because they weren't testing properly. And so what we have to do when we're reporting on numbers is actually look at the context of the numbers. Amy Maximum, who I am quoting here, is a science journalist and an infectious disease reporter at Nature. And she's done a lot of pandemic reporting. And one of her main points to science journalists is that everything about a pandemic line is a storyline, and you can go through anything from testing people to vaccinating people to communicating people. Within each of these aims, there are protagonists who overcome complications and find solutions, and these are, in fact, always the elements of a good narrative story. Amy also adds that it's more important to be responsible than provocative, right? Don't raise provocative questions about a vaccine if you think it's going to do actual harm. be honest that we don't know all the answers. In this case, I'm just looking at the fact that even though we're vaccinating, we have variants of the original coronavirus discovered around the world. Do we know what these entirely mean? Do we know what they mean for the vaccines? Do we know what they mean for the future of the pandemic? We don't. So we need to be honest about that. And we need to share what we do know. So this is from a current chart, just analyzing some of the things we know about these. And finally, I want to close with a few points from Ochian Ogoto, who is a Kenya-based science journalist and editor. And it has raised the point repeatedly in the conversations I've had with him and others that we have to remind ourselves that ethics always matter. And that's not only the ethics of the scientists themselves, but that's our ethics. So we're relying on a lot of information from people in the front lines of a pandemic. We need to make a point of asking every source if they can be named in the story, especially if it's sensitive information. We don't do harm in this kind of situation, and remember to treat every source, whether we agree with them or not, with respect. Because this is the bottom line of this pandemic, right? We're not writing to make our sources happy. We don't worry about our critics in the way, or we shouldn't, in the way we tell these stories. We're getting information out there because people's lives are on the line. And it's our readers, our listeners, our viewers, and the people who are in the direct path of a very dangerous pandemic who should be our number one concern in the way we tell these stories. And thank you. I think I have actually kept to my 20-minute timeline, and I'm happy to answer questions that Jean has and that any of you may have.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That was a very informative presentation. So we'll now turn to questions from me. But while we do that, I'm seeing some questions come through on Zoom. Please keep them up. If you have any questions, please jot them down, and we'll come to them following my Q&A with Deborah. My first question, Deborah, is about how has COVID-19 changed the field of science journalism? Give us some examples that demonstrate the change.
Oh, that's a good question. So one of the things that I think has happened during the pandemic is you've seen a lot more attention being paid to science journalists, right? And a lot more publications of, I'm speaking primarily from the United States, but I think you could make a case that this happens elsewhere as well. You've seen the rise of visibility of science journalists. And with that, you've seen a lot of pressure on science journalists to tell the stories carefully, to tell them in full. You've seen something that you don't always see in science, which is a competition to get the story first. That doesn't always serve us well, but certainly in this particular time, when you have a lot of journalists competing for audience and space on this issue, we've seen a little bit more of that herd mentality in journalism. And I think it's also brought more and more public attention to the fact that we're here. I mean, a lot of times people have tended to dismiss science journalists as sort of in the, over here on the science geek and nerd part of the story. But right now we're telling the story. And that's meant both pressure on us to work very quickly and keep it accurate. And it's made us more visible targets. Right. And I think that it's certainly in the United States, I was just talking to a friend of mine who writes for the New Yorker who had to go off Twitter because he was writing pro-vaccine stories and he was getting so many death threats, and people were sending him images of, heads exploding this is the United States, obviously. As guns were shot into his face. And so we've also had to, and I think this has been good for the profession, People have sometimes criticized science journalists as being stenographers and just purveyors of happy talk information about science and promoters of science. We're not in a position with COVID-19 that we can do that. If the science is right, we need to tell that story fairly. If the science is wrong, we tell that story too. And so I think it's imposed some of those kinds of both the visibility and the stress and the structure of hard news on our professions that I think actually are going to be very good for us in the long term.
Great, great. You mentioned a little bit about the rush to get the news out, which has been the change. What is the role of journalists when it comes to reporting and writing about science, you think? How do they differ, if at all?
In compared to, say, a news reporter?
Yeah.
Or standard news reporter? So one of the things that's very standard in political reporting, certainly in my country, is that political reporters operate as if they're always two sides to a story, right? In our country, we have two leading political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. So whenever anyone is reporting on a policy, it's here's this side, the Republican side, here's this side, the Democratic side. And that, I'm going to say, both maintains and sometimes masquerades as objectivity. What we've figured out as science journalists is that doesn't work for us, because often there are not two equal sides to a story. There is not the equal vaccine science, anti-vaccine movement. Those are not equal, right? If you look at climate change, the weight of the evidence and the consensus of scientists is climate change is real. There are climate change deniers. They are not equal. So we've learned over the years from making the mistake of reporting like political reporters that what we don't do, and one of the ways we serve our readers worst, is by hewing to the old political model of reporting. It's science journalists, and this is distinctly different. It's on us to do our homework, to figure out where the weight of the evidence is or the consensus of the science is, given that that can change, but the consensus of the science now, and to report from that position of evidence-based, I'm going to say truth, acknowledging that truth is multifaceted, but evidence-based truth. And I know for myself as a science journalist, once I have done all my homework and read preprints and peer-reviewed studies and figured out where I think the weight of the story is, I tell the story from that perspective. And I think that makes science journalists unique in a way that people who cover other areas don't always follow quite as well, or don't need to.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting what you said, that in science journalism, there are not always two sides to a story. So people look to the US as one of the countries at the forefront of science journalism. Can you tell us how it has taken shape and how it's moving forward?
Yes, interestingly enough, I just wrote an essay for Science magazine called Science Journalism Grows Up, which is coming out in about 3 days. It's coming out on the 23rd of April. And they just sent me a message saying it was embargoed, so I can't actually tell you much more than that. So annoying. So American science journalism, the United States was one of the first countries to kind of move toward professional science journalism. The Science Service, which was an organization that, paid journalists to just report on science, was founded in 1921. The United States National Association of Science Writers was chartered in 1934. So we go back way early in the 20th century in terms of thinking about professional science journalism. And for the most part, that is unusual. Many countries in the last few decades have really started focusing on science journalism, but we started early. One of the big changes, and you'll hear me talk about this consistently, is that early American science journalism was very rah-rah, very gee whiz, very, we're on the side of science. And in fact, people criticize this quite a bit. People who study American science journalism say that really into the 60s and 70s, American science journalism was so pro-science that they didn't even critically look at, say, and this is true, the development of nuclear weapons. So, you know, if you went and looked at the coverage at that time, it was very positive without raising any questions about either ethics or environmental effects. And that really didn't change until the 1960s and 70s, when the consequences of technology, air pollution, water pollution, right, many exposure to really dangerous chemical compounds and pesticides, all sort of came bubbling up. And so it's really only been, I would say that aware science journalism where people actually think like journalists rather than promoters of science, we're not so different from the rest of the world, right? I think in many countries you started seeing science journalists, it became a profession in many other countries starting in the late 20th century, and that's where you see American science journalism also making this shift. I'd say the other two things that you see in this later period is the rise of science journalism as a dedicated profession, so that universities in the United States and around the world began training programs in science journalism. You see more and more organizations for science journalists. The OISJA, the European Union Science Journalists Association, was founded in 1971, for instance. The World Federation of Science Journalists in the in this century, right about the turn of the 21st century. So we also see not only the rise of associations and dedicated science journalists around the world, but we see connections, which to me is one of the best developments of recent years, that we're not, as I say to my US friends, we're not just reporting in the US bubble, right? We're reminded that we're part of a global community and we learn from each other, which is one of the things I like about your meeting today, obviously, but it's really an important positive shift in the profession.
Yep, that sounds great. So with that shift, how has the demand for journalists with expertise in science changed? Has that gone up dramatically? And do you have any numbers or data to share with us today?
I don't have a lot of good data because the numbers in science journalism tend to get awash in the digital changes in journalism in general, which have in many cases, I would say, erased some of the gains that I think we once had. We had, for instance, in the US, many more science sections in newspapers in the 1980s and 90s than we do today. Part of that is because many of those newspapers are not around anymore, right? So what we really have seen is a shift to digital reporting and the rise of digital science reporting. And that turns out to be a major growth field. Nice. There are a number of new science magazines. We publish one at MIT, Undark. And just to talk about audience for a minute, we started Undark in 2016, so it's new. It started out with, as I'm always saying to people, about 3 readers. It's now got between 20 and 50 million readers. And to me, that's a measurement of something else, which is the huge amount of interest in understanding science and the recognition, not just by journalists, but I hope by society, of what a powerful transformative force science is and how much it plays a role in our everyday lives. So we've seen the rise more of digital science journalism, and certainly in mainstream outlets that have continued to thrive, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. They're continuing to hire more and more science journalists. So, I mean, the Globe just put out a call for 6 new science journalists, wow. Right? And they're not hiring so much in other fields because I think that at least there's a growing awareness, partly driven by COVID, partly by awareness that climate change is just looking over our shoulders is the problem. that we need people who can tell these stories and tell them well.
Yeah. So you talked about the changes in the growth of journalists and science journalists. Let's look at the other side, the audience. Have you seen their appetite, their needs change in recent years?
That's a wonderful question, Jane. I think, yes, it's interesting to me because I go out and I talk to, mostly because I'm a book author, I go out and I do a lot of public talks. And I'm always surprised and glad to be reminded that sometimes what we think of as the non-science savvy American public knows more about some of this than I do. I think there's a real awareness in general that science has a huge influence on people's lives. And I think we're caught in a kind of uncomfortable situation that I don't know the answer to, in which that's a global recognition, and it both increases people's appetite to know and increases people's hostility. People are hostile to powerful transformative forces, right? The anti-vaccine movement grew out of this very sense that things were happening that were affecting their lives that were not in their control, right? And so I think we are in a situation where both we see this rising interest and awareness of the importance of this information, and in some corners, this growing hostility to that information and to what people in some corners will dismiss as the mainstream media, or in the case of our past president, the enemy of the people, right?
So what advice do you have for journalists or media organizations that want to report and write deeply about science? Why do you think that is important as well?
I mean, I do think of science as one of the most important, powerful, transformative forces. And it's also a testament both to human intelligence and to human short-sightedness. We often move very quickly into technological developments without really thinking about their implications, right? And I think science needs watchdogs, which are science journalists, people who follow it and understand it and report both on its effects and its rights and its wrongs, right? So I think that's especially important today. I think that we see, certainly in the US, a shift toward more publications hiring trained science journalists. I want to emphasize that there are lots of ways beyond getting an expensive university education that you can learn about science journalism, right? The kind of organizations that I'm talking about, the kind of work you're doing here, the training sessions by many associations and science journalism organizations. At the Knight Science Journalism Program, we offer all kinds of free resources for science journalists. We're currently put a free handbook for how to edit science on our website, which is downloadable to anyone who wants it. And we're also running, I don't mean this as an advertisement, but in case it's helpful, a series of 6 free webinars for anyone who wants to sign up on different aspects of editing science, from environment, we have a public health one, we have a controversial science one, and we have a basics of science one, by the way, if people were just trying to come up to speed there in September, that has some really wonderful high-profile journalists like Ed Young from The Atlantic. And that's, if you go to the KSJ website and look at the resources page, you can find all of these and sign up for free. And I will say we're looking now at translation, right? One of the things that's, when you're getting a lot of information from a country like the United States that tends to be very English language focused, is that the information's all in English. So we're now in the process of getting bids to start translating that written handbook into other languages. And we're going to do that and put those on the website. And we're also looking at doing some closed captioning on the webinars for people who don't speak English so that they could watch the webinar but get the information in their own language. I mean, the daunting challenge there are lots of different languages. Yeah. But it is possible to be a smart, focused science journalist if your editors will give you the room to learn. Uh-huh. And it is possible to be self-taught. Many science journalists are journalists who just like science and studied it themselves.
Well, thank you for great information on a lot of free resources, it sounds like. So for starters, our audience could turn to the website, the free resource that's offered on your website, the Knight Science Journalism Program.
I'm going to put the website into the chat here.
That would be very helpful.
And so this is our main website. If you go to it, there's a resources page, and I think you can get to that. Hang on, by ksj.mit.edu. I have to talk aloud while I'm typing this. Resources. And if you go there, you'll see both the science editing program, but also a free program for fact checking, which is another thing in talking about how do we become a trusted source. You want to get it right. And so we also offer a lot of free resources on how do you fact check a story. Yeah. And we're running a free workshop on that too, by the way. It's a virtual workshop, so you'll find that there too.
That'll be very useful. Thank you. My next question is about, one or two excellent examples of science journalism that you've come across lately that you want to flag to us.
So Ed Yong, who I mentioned, has done a lot of big picture looks at COVID-19, and he's looked at why we were unprepared for the pandemic. He's looked at some of the science of the pandemic in very big picture terms. If you wanted to look at a series of stories that just gave you an overview of the science and the political complications and some very heroic doctors and just a lot of the sort of cultural, social issues of medicine. If you went to his archive at The Atlantic, I highly recommend it. And he just won the Polk Award, which is in the United States just short of a Pulitzer. It often precedes the Pulitzer for his reporting on COVID-19. And he just won another award for his medical reporting. So he's a great example of someone who takes all of these different data points and puts them together in a big picture sense. If I was going to follow someone on the pandemic itself who was entirely trustworthy, had flagged every important issue, I would look at Helen Branswell's work at STAT. STAT does not require a subscription the way The Atlantic will. You can get some of The Atlantic stories without paying, but not all. But if you go over to STAT, it would just be hang on, I'm going to type it in here. I think that might be a lowercase s, but statnews.com. And you looked at Helen Branswell. Helen also just won a Polk Award for her coverage. And she is best known as the journalist who first called out the pandemic. She actually flagged it in December 2019 because she's such a long-time expert pandemic reporter. And so I look to her stuff when I'm looking at someone who's going to report on it in a more daily sense and who's always going to get it right. Mm-hmm. And her stories have been really useful to me as just a reader in navigating the pandemic and knowing, when I can take off my mask and when I can't and all of the things I need to know. Those are both two U.S. examples. Kai Cooperschmidt in Science, who's based in Germany, is a phenomenal pandemic reporter. And I would put him in there as someone who is wholly worth following in just the same way. Really, really good.
All right, great. So I've got my last question in front of me, and then I was just checking the chat room, and it says a participant calls you a rock star in the field of science journalism. How about that?
I'm blushing. Thank you. I'm really honored and flattered by that.
So now I'm asking the rock star, what do you think will be the next hot science topic once the COVID-19 dies down, and why?
Well, I think once we're not living in this sort of urgent, hugely disruptive period of the pandemic, that we're going to go back to looking at climate change. I mean, it's here. We certainly saw it in, superstorms, super typhoons, the hurricane season, the wildfires in the West, the wildfires in Australia. But the fact of the moves that it's making have been kind of overshadowed by the pandemic. I think once the pandemic settles down, we're going to continue to recognize, speaking of transformative situations, what a transformative situation that is, right? And not in all positive ways. And I think the more we're able to inform people of that, the better off all of us are going to be. So in science journalism, I see that as the next big one. And then, in other ways, I think there's some very interesting technological progress that we're still sorting out, right? In terms of space travel, in terms of other technological developments with transportation. I mean, all of those things are going to continue to come. And finally, almost everyone thinks that eventually we'll see another pandemic. We hope it won't be like this one, right? But certainly the potential is there. And so I think for everyone who is here, understanding public health and building up their credentials on COVID-19, just be aware that eventually we're going to need you again. Unfortunately.
No.
I know.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your thoughtful comments. They were great. We'll now turn to the questions from the floor, and then we'll move online later. So this is another chance to remind you, on those online, please submit your questions in the Zoom chat room, and we will come to you. All right. Our first question comes from Lee Jin-han, a medical reporter from 동아일보. I will read his question on his behalf. When working in the field, there are times when conflict arises. For example, a patient with a blood clot comes into the emergency room after vaccination. The reporter in charge of the case wants to report this fact sooner than others. However, from the standpoint of medical journalists, I think it is necessary to provide proper information after understanding the relationship between vaccine and blood clots. If not, it could increase the fear in the general public over the vaccine. Which reporting method is best in this case? Deborah, what would you say?
That's such a smart question. Did I cut you off, Jane?
No, I was just turning to you.
Yeah. This is such a smart and real life question because it's certainly playing out for us today, both with the AstraZeneca vaccine and with the J&J vaccine. And I don't know that we fully understand the relationship between those vaccines and the formation of blood clots. It's obviously incredibly rare. If you looked at the J&J vaccine in the United States, there's been something like 10 million shots and 6 cases of blood clots, right? So we're talking about a fairly small effect that appears to be, if I'm following it, in a particular population. And so I really advise against being the reporter who rushes out with the first alarmist story about blood clots. if I was in a situation where I was in that hospital and that case occurred, I would go back and I would look at the whole context of this, and I would report that we have seen, if I had the permission of the patient in the hospital, or you don't always have to name the patient, if I had the permission of the doctors treating this, to put that into some kind of context. But I think it's really important with things like blood clots, speaking of things we don't know, both to put the risk in perspective. It's small. The chance of actually developing blood clots from getting COVID is much higher. And to put it into that full context, and then to not just do one story. In the way that I was talking about the slow drip of stories, we don't just do the first story. We keep following this issue. And actually, Roxanne Campsey, who's a Canadian journalist who covers COVID-19, just did a long story I think it was in The Atlantic, actually, in which she looked at all the competing theories about the blood clots. So the other thing we can do as journalists is use our social media presence. We can both cover the stories, but if we have a following, then we can use our social media presence to direct people to really smart studies that evaluate these issues or link to those stories in our own work, or use those stories as a template to contact researchers in our own country who are likely also looking at some of these problems, right? And to do that. But going back to my earlier, death virus example, don't do that, right? It feeds the anti-vax movement. It scares people unnecessarily. It overstates the risk. And one of the most important aspects of any risk story is to keep that risk in perspective, right? If it's an enormous risk, if like 9 out of 10 people were getting blood clots, we'd be telling a different story, right? So it's really on us to make sure that people understand if the risk is very, very small or large or moderate, and what the scientific community is doing to respond to that risk.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Hwang Ho-taek, professor from KAIST, who's actually at the conference room to ask the question.
I really appreciate your timely and informative lecture on science journalism. You quoted Donald Trump saying, "I wanted to always play it down because I don't want to create panic." Every administration, every politician likes to politicize science to some degree. In Korea, a well-known conservative pastor against the government said to the congregation, "Don't wear mask, God protect us." But he got COVID-19, and a lot of believers following his advice got pandemic. Because of hyper-partisanship, media fragmentation, people ask the question even to the science reporters, whose side are you on? Instead of, is it true? In this pandemic era, I want to hear your wisdom about how to earn public trust of ordinary people in science journalism. Thank you.
Thank you. That is really an excellent question. And it is a situation, unfortunately, where people will see this, even though I made a strong case that, in science journalism, we don't report one side or the other side. People take sides. And we've seen that pattern that you're talking about with the high-profile minister in South Korea over and over again. In the United States, there was just a case recently of a very influential celebrity COVID denier. I don't know if you saw this story, in Norway, who died of COVID-19 this week, and in the course of having anti-COVID parties infected close to 100 people. So whose side am I on? I'm actually on the side of people who are trying to live their lives with some safety, right? That's whose side I'm on. I don't think that journalists should ever be seen as on the side of any source, right? We're not on the side of our science to sources because that would make us promoters of them. We're not on the side of politicians because often politicians have, agendas that influence the way they're going to present risk, right? And almost any politician, frankly, in my opinion, is going to take a step to downplay risk. They're afraid of panic, and they're also afraid of losing support. We certainly saw that with Donald Trump, right? He wanted his supporters to see him as a success, and that runs through politics. So science reporters have the right to say, I am on the side of the person who is at risk of getting COVID-19. That's where I stand. And it's my job and even my duty to give that person the best and most accurate information possible, right? And this is an apolitical stance. People want to make science political, but in fact, a virus has no political affiliation, right? There's not a political move we'll make that makes any difference at all to how the virus is going to replicate or how it may mutate, right? Well, actually, it can, in fact, create an environment that fosters mutation. But viruses are not political, and we are telling the story of the virus.
Thank you. I like your comment about virus doesn't have any political affiliation. Yes, indeed. Our next question comes from Park Ga-young, reporter from Korea Herald.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your insight. It was very informative. My question is more of general journalism question. You mentioned about repeating over and over again until the message is crossed. I totally agree with you, and I want to be patient, but at the same time, I want to be effective. I feel sometimes frustrated people who are not willing to listen a tiny bit. They just are trapped in their tiny chamber and they listen to the same echo and the same narrative over and over again. Do you think, is there any suggestion or anything, any recommendation for us for those kind of problem? Is there anything that reporters can do to get message across to those kind of people?
You've raised such an important and frustrating point, and we have these discussions ourselves. Are there audiences that we just can't reach, right? Are there people who have stepped away from science to such a degree, have so little trust, not only for journalists, but for science itself, that there's no way to get across? So, I'm not going to tell you that I have the magic answer to solve this. If I did, I am positive that instead of winning a Pulitzer, I would win a Nobel. But here are two things that I try to practice. One is I do believe in, sharing the information in repetition in which the repetition is not obvious. So if I want to do a story about the way the virus being airborne, I might take that from a number of different angles. I might, do a consumer health story in which masks are most effective. I might do a story on a COVID outbreak, right? Do a case study of a COVID outbreak and analyze the use of masks. I might look at researchers. There are researchers who have actually looked at, put masks on mannequins and puffed air through them. I might do a story about the scientists who are actually doing mask research. I might do a story on on the airborne nature of respiratory viruses. So I would tell the same story over and over, but I would tell it every time as if it was a different story. And that puts a lot of pressure on us. But I also think that that's one of the ways that we keep doing this repetition. The other thing that I've found, and I cannot tell you that it is 100% effective, is that I think one of the strongest tools that journalists have in general, not just science journalists, or maybe science journalists, is narrative storytelling, in which we tell a story that does not appear to be about information, but appears to be just about the story. And when you do that, you can pull people into the story without them actually realizing that you are trying to teach them something about a particular area of science. And the example I'm going to give you very quickly has to do not with COVID-19 at all, but because I'm a toxicology journalist. At one point, I really wanted to make people understand how dangerous carbon monoxide exposure is. And I used a murder case in which a man had killed his wife. He had faked broken a gas fitting, and first suffocated her and then broken a gas fitting, right? And when the toxicologist went into that apartment, he took one look at her body, which was pale and cold and stiff, and said, no, that's not a carbon monoxide death. And so when I'm telling that story, it's like, well, why wouldn't it be a carbon monoxide death? How can you just look at the body, right, and know that that's not carbon monoxide? And you can do that because when you're poisoned by carbon monoxide, the bond in which it pushes oxygen out of your bloodstream and replaces it is so powerful that it changes the color of the blood. And people who die of carbon monoxide poisoning, people will also describe those as healthy looking corpses. They flush pink. And so I will use this. So I walk through this whole murder story when and I'll use that. I never say to people, I want to teach you something about carbon monoxide and how it's dangerous and how it works. I say, essentially what I say to them, let me tell you a really good murder story, right? And so some of the things that we also do is try to figure out ways to layer the scientific information into a really compelling, good, addictive story. And that is, of course, hard, but that's an incredibly effective way of getting information to people without essentially putting your finger in their face and lecturing them about the dangers of carbon monoxide, right? Or COVID-19, if I was using another example.
That is a fascinating murder story, I have to say.
It's a really good one.
Yeah. Our next question comes from Habib Toumi, advisor at Bahrain News Agency. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Debbie, for a great lecture. I really like your open enthusiasm for science journalism, which is very, very much needed now in the middle of this pandemic and infodemic caused by social media. However, science journalism is not as straightforward as it looks or as it sounds. There are so many ways to interpret data and to impose bias. What are some of the best ways to ensure equity and ethics in science journalism? Thank you.
You know, that's an excellent question. And of course, you know, a lot of times we're in a position when we are writing for an audience that we think is not fully science educated or literate of oversimplifying, right? Or using analogies to explain, or in some cases, not perfectly conveying all the nuances or even ethics of a story. I am not a fan. And so my answer to that is one of the things that I think we could do better is to acknowledge that science is a process, right? Journalism is a event-driven medium. And in journalism, we tend to report on science as it's a series of events, when in fact, science is a process. It's a process of inquiry. A study, a finding, a preprint, even a published peer-reviewed paper may be no more than a data point on this long inquiry into what reality is. So I am not a fan in journalism, and I think that it will get at some of your issues of a single study story, or a journalist who parachutes into a story and does one report on the issue and leaves, right? Because you've always left other things on the table, partly for reasons of space and partly for reasons of the focus of your particular story. So I believe one of the things that we can and should do better is acknowledge that if we're going to report on a single study, that we need to follow it up with a more nuanced look. And if we're going to report on a particular scientist, we need to also make sure that we do our homework about that scientist. And if we're going to pull together, as I cited Ed Yong, a big picture issue, then we need to make sure that we've looked at all the issues. So we don't ever stop with just the one story. We continue to layer it on, and you will find often when you do that and you talk to people just a little more about that first story, then you will see the ethical dilemmas and the shadows and the nuances, and then you could just continue to report those out too.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question comes from Rafael Lebledo, Deputy Director at Nestaler de Comunicación in Mexico.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Yoon. Thank you very much, Professor Blum. Congratulations and thank you for this very impressive talk you gave us, and this big opportunity to reflect on the scientific journalism. My question is, Mexico, as many countries around the world, are in this developing countries. Our journalism is not as professional as it could be, as some of other countries has it. So my question is, how can we improve the formation of new journalists in science, especially in developing countries in which journalists are not so convinced in a specialization and also at science and academic life? How can we face this challenge in developing countries?
You know, I think this is a great question. I'm actually encouraged. I want to tell you about some of the developments in science journalism in Latin America. And one of our KSJ fellows, in fact, right before the pandemic, is a Mexican journalist, a science journalist, Ivan Carrillo. And he's been involved in a project which you may have seen, the Cross-Border Project, in which journalists in Mexico report COVID-19 in collaboration with journalists in Argentina and journalists in Guatemala and journalists in Colombia. So we're starting to see in less developed areas, and I would certainly make the case that that was true across the global south and around the world. We're starting to see the slow, gradual formation of these connected groups of science journalists. As you know, the next World Conference of Science Journalists will be in Medellin, Colombia, next spring. And that's, I think, a general shift in the right direction. And we're also starting to see countries with more established science journalists work with countries in developing areas. So with SciDev.net, with some of the other programs that are really working with journalists in Africa and Latin America, we're starting to see a more global effort in the profession to work together, to teach each other. And I want to say this finally, to learn from each other. I mean, one of the things that I've learned, I was a board member of the World Federation of Science Journalists for a couple terms a while back, and I've been involved in some of the international meetings, is that talking to journalists from other countries always makes me smarter. It's really important in a country that has established science journalism, imperfect, but established science journalism like the United States, to remember that the international perspective and the lessons from other countries make you smarter. So if you wanted to follow up with me, I'm easy to find, and I would be happy to talk with you about this further and connect you with people if you wanted to be connected with them.
Thank you very much.
Okay, our next question comes from Ranjit Kumar, independent journalist from India.
Thank you, Professor Yoon. Very good morning to all. Mine is not exactly a question, but an observation. was a very challenging time for science journalists in India during COVID pandemic. When COVID pandemic started spreading all over the country, rumors also started floating, various kinds of rumors. And one of the rumors was that the newspapers are the carriers of coronavirus. And because of this rumor, the newspaper circulation dramatically went down. The newspaper industry was also affected. People stopped buying newspapers. So I just wanted to know from Deborah, what do you think about this development? It was very challenging time for journalists. All the newspaper circulation went down, down, and still not recovered.
I just hate that. For one thing, it's completely wrong. And for another thing, it's destructive. I was looking up international attacks on science journalists for another talk I gave recently, and I saw photographs of Indian journalists holding signs saying, "Stop attacking journalists," right? So I get completely that this is an unusually challenging situation, and I can't tell you how to fix that, obviously, from here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But I hope that people in India are going to increasingly realize that it works against them. I mean, the pandemic right now is really problematic in India, as we know. And what you need more than anything else is people to make sure that there are journalists out there who can share that information. In the way that I was talking about, journalists are on the side of people at risk. You need journalists out there informing them and telling them where they can get vaccinated, if they can get vaccinated, and how to be most safe, and providing them with the most current information. So, mostly I want to say how much I hate hearing this. And if there's anything that the international community of science journalists can do to be supportive, I hope you'll let me know, right? I'm connected with all kinds of science journalists and foundations that support science journalism. And if we can be proactive on your behalf, I'd like to do that.
Yep, that would be great. Our next question comes from someone from the conference room that would like to ask a question. Yes.
Hello, my name is Jae Shim from Korea University. In my journalism and mass communication class, we are dealing with news values. And my question is, for my students, I'd like to hear about your answer. And what is the most important, or the more important news values in science journalism compared to other area of journalism? That's my first question. And second question is, how can you deal with the social scientific issues compared to natural science issues?
So what is the most important thing that we do, or the most important, I didn't fully follow that.
News values like social significance and deviance and oddity and sensationalism, etc.
Sure. So, I mean, I don't think that the community of science let me back up. Science is a human enterprise. And that means that to do our jobs well, we cover it as a human enterprise. We acknowledge that, like any other human enterprise, I'll start by saying there are moments of brilliance in science. There are also egos. There's mistakes. There are conflicts of interest. There are all kinds of sort of social and cultural consequences that it's important for us as science journalists both to understand and that should read into the way that we cover science. And so among the things I think we have learned slowly as science journalists is we don't cover science as if it's a monolithic culture of people who are smarter and more perfect than the rest of us. There are all the same human, complicated social issues within the community of science. And to give you an example of that, in the United States recently, it used to be quite widely accepted in the United States that successful male academics could take advantage of young female graduate students with impunity. And that just started being covered by American science journalists in the last decade. Obviously, this went on longer than the last decade. And recently, two of the leading American scientists, one of them was Jeff Marcy, who was, actually thought at one point to be on the short list for a Nobel for his work in looking at astrobiology. And the other is Francisco Ayala, who was an infectious disease and an evolutionary biologist, are about to be, they're up for consideration of being kicked out of the US National Academy of Sciences for their bad behavior. And that bad behavior was reported by journalists, right? So I think, if I'm following you right, it's important for science journalists to one, cover science as the human socially complex enterprise it is. And second, just briefly moving over into covering social sciences as opposed to hard sciences, we don't do that all that well, right? And I say that as someone who actually wrote a book on the biology of love and affection, right? So I did spend a lot of time earlier in my career writing about behavioral biology. I actually did a newspaper series on behavioral biology. And I know that when we get into the social sciences, the sciences that try to actually study us and study science, we're less informed, I think, than in other areas of science. Having said that, there are science magazines in the United States who have just started hiring social science reporters. And one of them, Science News, it's a former fellow of mine. Science journalism is a small community in the United States, right? So Sujata Gupta, who was a former fellow of my program, is now the social sciences reporter at Science News, because we recognize slowly and not enough that not all science is physics and not all science is medicine, and that the scientists who study human behavior and its complications and its nuances are telling us stories that we also need to hear. I hope that answered your question.
We have a lot of questions coming in the chat room, but I've just picked a few, I'm afraid. There's a very topical question from Jiahao Jiang from China. He's the chief science technology reporter at China Daily in China. And his question, I'm afraid you've asked three, but I could only go with one because of the time restraint. How can we, the media, encourage the public to get vaccinated?
I think we do that, right? In that, we write stories about the positive effect of vaccination. We're writing stories about what people who have been vaccinated can now do that the non-vaccinated can't. We write stories about the vaccines and how they work. I think that we're actually doing a pretty good job of encouraging vaccination. And I think you see that reflected in the millions of people who have gotten vaccinated already. Having said that, we're running into a number of barriers at the moment. Some is the concern over AstraZeneca and J&J and the blood clots, which, makes people nervous, even though all of this research is really to quantify the risk. But it makes people nervous. We're running into shortages of vaccine supplies. I know, excuse me, I saw a story recently about the Serum Institute in India, which is one of the primary manufacturers of AstraZeneca, basically being almost out of its ability to supply vaccines, right? So we're running into the issue of just not having the vaccines. We're running into mistrust about vaccines Some of the vaccines appear to be less effective than others. There's been a lot of recent questions about the Russian vaccine, for instance, and how honest the reporting is on the effectiveness of that vaccine. So we're running it, and we need to report that too. And finally, there is a highly organized and completely dishonest anti-vaccine movement. And we are running into that. So my answer is, I think that in a lot of ways, we're doing a great job, and that right now we're hitting some headwinds, and that, again, my endlessly boring message is we just keep doing this until we get past some of those headwinds. When they clear AstraZeneca and J&J on the blood clot, whatever the limits they come up with or whatever, we report that well, and we continue, and we go out and we interview people who have gotten those shots. I myself got the J&J shot 5 weeks ago, and as you see, I'm not hospitalized for blood clots. It's a very and I'm going out and doing all kinds of, well, actually, I'm still wearing a mask because I'm me, but nevertheless, we continue to tell the stories of successes, right?
Good to know. The last question comes from Nazir Aijaz from Pakistan. There is no concept of science journalism in Pakistan. Even the universities do not enroll science students for a mass communication degree. Yes, we have health reporters with no required qualification. In this case, what would you suggest?
You know, that's a daunting question, but I can tell you that every single country that has organized science journalism program started in exactly the same place at one time. There's actually a surprisingly good group of science journalists in Uganda, for instance, right? So I think it's really important to say, I'm going to start by talking to the people who are covering science journalism, even if they're not where I want them to be, and I'm going to bring them all together. And I'm going to reach out to other people who are really interested in training science journalists and get their help. And those resources are there, I promise, right? You start small and then you slowly build it up. And I've seen that happen in all kinds of countries where you wouldn't even have thought there might be a strong science journalist program, but there is.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Thank you, Deborah, for your extraordinary presentation and answers to the questions. We all learned quite a lot today. Please join me in giving a big round of applause for Deborah. And thank you, everyone, for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
It's been a pleasure and an honor to be here. Good night.
Good night.
Oh, it's good morning for you. Good night for me. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. This ends our segment of the presentation. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.